Hello, everyone. My name is Aisha Rahim, and I will be presenting today about bias in AI. Before I get started, I want to introduce myself. As I said, my name is Aisha Rahim. I'm a medical director at Johns Hopkins Health Plan, and I've been trained in internal medicine at UConn. As you all know, UConn, where men and women are champion. After that, I worked as a hospitalist for many years and then worked as a medical director, urgent care. I received executive education in Harvard Business School and MIT in artificial intelligence. I'm a faculty at Harvard Mays Institute and a board director at American Diabetes Association. Today, I'm here to talk about a topic which is very near and dear to my heart. The topic is very important for me because I work in health equity. I lead health equity for my Johns Hopkins Health Plans. And what I've realized in my experience and research in artificial intelligence that if there is bias in AI, that is a threat to health equity in healthcare. So, with that at the back of your mind, I would like to dive deeper a little bit into what we're going to talk about today. Now, this is going to be very high level. And the reason being it's going to be high level is that I want to give you introduction. And then once we meet in person, we're going to have a chance to dive deeper into these topics. So starting with that, I'm going to start off with AI bias in healthcare. Then we're going to talk about the effects of AI bias on healthcare. We're going to discuss few a little bit things about big pharma, AI bias drug discovery, and how AI affects in that. And then we're going to talk about best practices for overcoming AI bias in healthcare. We're going to take an example from Johns Hopkins Medicine, how we took some practical steps in removing bias. And then we're going to reach the conclusion and we'll discuss that. So, starting with that, what is bias? Bias in AI refers to the systemic errors or prejudice present in the data, algorithms, or model used to train AI system. These biases can lead to unfair, inaccurate, or discriminatory outcomes. So that's in a nutshell what bias is. These are the systemic errors or prejudice present in the data. So understand that the world around us and we all are biased. If we ask each and every person, most of us are biased. And when we use that bias and feed into training models, that bias is going to be exacerbated. Okay. So understand that bias exists. We have to understand it, that it is going to be present, and how and what steps are we going to take to remove it. So, what are the types of biases that we have to think about when you're talking about AI? And this is not the finite list that we have here. There is a lot more that you're going to encounter when you're going to read about AI and its systems, but these are few of those. And it could be bias in the data. It could be bias in the algorithms. It could be the humans that are biased that are building and training these models. It could be representation bias. It could be bias in the automation systems, and it could be fleet loop bias, like when we interact with artificial intelligence models and we give them bias information, they get trained into it as well. It could be gender, racial, and socioeconomic bias being fed into these artificial intelligence models. So, but again, as I said, this is not a complete list of bias. The biases could be much more than what it is presented here. Let's look at what is state of bias in AI. When we look at the AI and the large language model, stable diffusion model is one of the large language models which takes the text that is present around us and translates into images. When we ask stable diffusion, what does the word looks like around us? This is what the answer stable diffusion model gave us. According to that, the world is run by white male CEOs. Women are rarely doctors, lawyers or judges. Men with dark skin commit crimes, and while women with dark skin flip burglars. So this is what it is. It's showing us a representation of what bias looks like around us. And so we have to understand that this is what is being fed into our AI models. Similar, this is the representation: predominantly white, Caucasian, male running the world, and predominantly male CEOs. This is also showing up what bias does. What artificial intelligence and large language do is that they exacerbate already existing bias. When you look at actual reality versus bias, you see there's sometimes a stark difference. Not all of the time, but sometimes there's a stark difference. And what I mean by that is, like, if you look at the make and model of the medical school and the classes, predominantly 50% of graduating class are women. And so with time, the number of applicants are increasing in terms of their make and model, as being a lot of them are women that are graduating from medical class. And so, but if you ask the stable diffusion model, it's going to show predominantly male class being graduating from medical school. And you, as you can see here, Association of Medical Colleges in 2019 said women comprise majority of enrolled US medical students. But the AI models and the AI data around us is not representing that, and that could be quite concerning. If you look at the Chat GPT, one of the large language model, they were asked to triage, the model was asked to triage a 26-year-old uninsured patient with crushing chest pain. What it did was it send the patient to a community health center because it was uninsured. Again, a bias in the system, which will translate to the output that is giving as an advice to a medical practitioner. Where if we ask if the patient is insured and it's 26-year-old with crushing chest pain, ChatGPT send that patient to acute care hospital. Again, bias in terms of socioeconomic status, insured versus uninsured, different outcomes. And that's quite concerning, because if we are, as medical practitioners, as physicians, as nurse practitioners, providers, facilitators, teachers, are teaching this information and also using this to take care of our patients, we are going to be affected by it, and it's going to lead to a wrong outcome or adverse events. And there are some scientific studies that are done on AI bias. Those are listed here. It basically says that any algorithmic bias, any biases that are going to be in any predictive or large language model, is going to translate to much more disparities in healthcare outcomes. And these were some international studies and then some national studies within the United States. So we have to understand AI bias leads to disparities and inequities, and translates ultimately to inequities in the healthcare systems. Now we're going to transition into why it matters. Why should we even worried about the bias? We know that we just learned that it leads to disparities in healthcare, and then further inequities, and obviously harm to the patients. But it also could lead to misdiagnosis, wrong results. If an organization deploys such AI model, it leads to damage to reputation of the organization. The stakeholders could be affected. It could bring legal scrutiny from different organizations such as FDA or any regulators that we are working with. And if it's a clinical trial or drug discovery, it would lead to drug errors and drug misdiagnosis, recalls. All that is going to be affected, and is ultimately going to affect the bottom line of the drug companies. So it has a wide variety of effects. Starting from effect onto patient care and outcomes, as well as into the legal world, as well as scrutiny from the regulators. So it's very important to understand, when you're in facilitator, educator, you have to keep that at the back of your mind. And if that's AI bias is built into systems and large language models and in your research, that is going to affect the outcomes, and ultimately will bring negative scrutiny into you. We discussed that. So let's move on to our next slide. We're going to talk a little bit about clinical trials and drug discovery. We know that a lot of companies and healthcare systems are using now AI models to streamline the drug development process. Okay, AI-driven drug discovery is at record high. More than 270 companies, at least in the United States and North America, are using different kind of large language models to do drug discovery, to sort out the molecules, to research into genotypes and phenotypes, to engage patient population. All that's happening. And what it is that once these drug discovery companies are using these large language models and AI systems, it is at risk for having a bias in their system. And if they don't tackle it appropriately, it can further delay the development of the drugs. And what happens is that once you have, there was a study actually done in 2019 at Tufts Center, that if there is a trial error in drug development, it costs around 180 million. dollars. So if you have bias in their systems and it causes an error and a lack of development of drug, it costs a lot of money at the end. So in order to avoid that, you got to fix the problem before it starts. You got to fix the data that is fed into the large language model, that the way it's being processed, and all that has to be fixed ahead of time. Unless, if you don't do that, that's going to result in hurting your bottom line. And it can translate to other industries as well, as not just big pharmaceutical companies. Now, one of the most important slides that or things that I talk about is what eventually could happen if you have bias in your systems, and in systems, as well as large language models that you deploy within your organization, or if you use large language models to develop curriculum, and the output that gives that curriculum is generated from large language model has bias, it can cause a lot of issues and ultimately some lawsuits as well. And one of the lawsuits I would say is listed here is the iTutor lawsuit. Okay, iTutor uh, used a software which discriminated against African American as well as elderly individuals when they applied for getting a job at their institution. And ultimately, what happened is, because of that discrimination, they ended up getting fined and sued by EEOC, Employment Opportunity Commission, and it causes them close to $360 million. Now, this is not a big number, but it sort of signals that if it's happening in other industries which have employed AI system, it will happen to the healthcare industry as well. United Healthcare, as listed here, had a lawsuit where they use algorithm to predict the risk of hospitalization in African American and higher. Obviously, the algorithms risk predicted that there is high risk for hospitalization, and then ended up in denying some benefits to those individuals. Again, example of a bias in AI system causing lawsuit. However, this lawsuit was ultimately dismissed by the judge, but it could signal, and it is signaling, that there could be more lawsuits that could be coming up, and we would be asked to look at our system from bias standpoint, and to make sure our data that we're feeding into or using for training large language models is not biased and is balanced. So a lot of other lawsuits are listed here. One was in Netherlands, one is Michigan's, and these are not really specifically lawsuit within the healthcare industry. These are in other industries, but it could be coming to us as well, and could definitely affect our bottom line, and can hurt our reputation as bigger organization. Now we have this is a study that which was done at Johns Hopkins Medicine, where they use standard CACS, Kaggle Pack system, which is a data set, to train the large language model to detect the rate of diabetic retinopathy in African American versus Caucasian individual. Okay, so what they found out that with the standard data sets that they used to train, there was quite a big discrepancy in terms of diagnosis of diabetic retinopathy in African versus Caucasian individual. In African American, it was close to 60%, and Caucasian was 73. So what could it mean? It means that when this large language model or imaging system is going to be used in diagnosis in African American individual, it is not going to diagnose individuals who actually have diabetic eye disease. What could it mean is that it could lead to misdiagnosis, meaning those patients who have the disease did not get diagnosed in a timely manner, and ultimately ended up having diabetic eye disease, and then ultimately blindness, as we know, as could be complication of the diabetic eye disease. And what does it mean? That African American population are likely to suffer more negative consequences as a result of we use this large language model in terms of detecting the diabetic retinopathy. So that is very important, because that can further increase the disparity between Caucasian versus African American, or even other race and ethnicity individuals as well, because there is a different way of diagnosis in one individual versus other, or one ethnicity versus other. So what they did was they rebalanced the model. They retrained the model with using generative adversarial network GAN, which is another kind of large language model, which could be used to balance and generate new images. And then that rebalancing could help in balancing the data, and then ultimately increasing detection of the diabetic retinopathy. And that's what happened. The rate of detection of diabetic retinopathy improved between those two population, those two ethnicities, Caucasian versus African American, and then ultimately end up improving the rates of diagnosis. So this is very important to understand that once we fix that AI bias, it helps to improve the rates of diagnosis, and specifically it is very important in healthcare industry because it could have very adverse outcomes. This is just an executive summary how AI systems could be used to debias the AI models and balance the data. Because once the data is balanced, it's fed into the large language models, the large language models are trained in it, and then it improves the rates and the outcomes between different ethnicities. The next slide is about MIT and the research in breast cancer screening. MIT developed and trained large language model, which helped them to improve the rates of detection of breast cancer in African American population. And they developed this large language model, which was trained on better data and trained on 60,000 patient mammogram. And what they end up doing was that it could detect breast cancer up to 5 years in advance, equally accurate for white and black women. And understand that this is a big development because previously the racial disparity in terms of rate of detection of cancer in African American females was much higher, meaning there was a lot less diagnosis in African American female, and when they were diagnosed, they were at higher stage, and then ultimately led to worse outcomes. 40% of Black women have higher breast cancer mortality, often diagnosed later than white women. And that's a fact, and the research have shown that. So with this better data set training, it improved the rate of detection and improved the rates of detection of the breast cancer, enhance the better outcome. And this is kind of research, and this is what the kind of outcomes that we are looking for. We want to improve the equity, health equity. We don't want to increase the disparity. Disparities which are already existing, it can get worse, and if we use already biased data and biased models. The question is, what can we do? What can we do as healthcare providers, physicians, researchers, students? What can we do to make sure that our data is not biased, or when we use that data to train large language model, the output is not biased? And that brings us to the governance aspect of the large language models. There is a lot of governance networks, the frameworks that are out there. One of them is NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology Risk Framework for AI. Biden's White House AI committee has also given us directives on what is the safe and acceptable use of AI. We can look into that. And there is several international standards as well. There is a European Act, European Union AI Act that we can look into, and OECD's AI principles. All of them talk about few of the basic things. It has to be usable. It has to have certain level of efficiency. It has to be transparent. It has to have no bias or reduced bias. Or we have to make sure that all these. It has to address the privacy, security, and all these aspects have to be met in order for the safe and effective use of AI in healthcare. This is one of the organization that I work for, which is Coalition for Healthcare AI. They're working on developing standards for a safe and trustworthy AI in healthcare specifically. I would like to look you up, and they have recently released the AI assurance, quality assurance framework for checking large language model whether they meet the AI standards or for trustworthy AI use or not. Because when you have your large language models go through that process of trustworthiness and all these principles of usefulness, safety, removing bias, security, transparency, explainability, interpretability, all that are addressed, it increases the trust in that model for both patients end users and for both providers, physicians, and the people who are building the model. So it has to, the large language models or AI that we're using has to build that trust once it checks off all the boxes on that governance standards that I'm talking about. And that is going to increase buyout from all the public, that these models are more safe to use, and then we can use in medicine for decision making, streamlining a drug discovery process, or automation of the tasks at the back end. So there could be a lot of use cases for artificial intelligence healthcare, but it all depends upon how we build those models, how we remove the bias, how do we make them meet the standards of governance that will ultimately build the trust of the public in those models, and we can trust their outcomes that come out of those models. So those are very important things that we have to think about when we're talking about artificial intelligence and models. And I talk a lot about that in different national and international conferences, how we build trust into AI models, how we remove bias, and I can have more conversations once we meet. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening in. And please send us any questions my way. I will be more than happy to address them. And have a good rest of your day.